I'm Glenn Barber, I'm Director of Corporate Affairs at SSE. We are proudly a UK-listed clean electricity infrastructure company and one of the co-sponsors of the UK Pavilion. A reminder briefly that this event is being live streamed on the UK government's YouTube channel, so anything you say is public. And because of that, I've promised my children that I would give them a shout out from Belém. So Orla and George, hope you're being good for mummy, go to bed. Having done that, let's kick off. We've got a great group around the table here. We've only got an hour, which means we're going to try and move quite quickly to make sure everybody gets some time. Please save your intros for when you are making your intervention. We'll try and keep them to 2 or 3 minutes. Just by way of a quick setup, it's easy to forget when you're in the blue zone, surrounded by like-minded people pursuing the clean energy transition, that the world that we're in has changed quite materially. Progress has been made, a lot of progress has been made on the energy transition, particularly in the UK, but we've got significant headwinds. And this is what we're describing as the elephant in the room, the long-held consensus on whether and how quickly we should be pursuing net zero. The energy transition has eroded significantly, not just in the UK, but in the wider world. And we've gone from a place of building back greener and everybody agreeing on that just a few years ago to drill, baby, drill, and all of the populism that comes with that. So I think it's important that we don't just dismiss that we understand the reasons behind it and debate them and come together for a discussion like this to try and identify ways we might go about rebuilding that consensus. So we've got a couple of speakers just to kick us off with some opening remarks. And I'll just ask for relatively brief interventions from those people after that. And with that, I'll hand over to my colleague, Alistair, former CEO of SSE, who remains chair of our distribution business, for some opening remarks, and then we'll turn to Lord Turner. Alistair.
Thanks, Glenn, and thanks to all of you for joining us for this discussion, which I think is an important one. It was actually a subject to the one question I just got asked when I did a press conference with the COP presidency on political consensus and how it impacts on private sector investment. Yeah, there'll be, sorry, keep the mic close, fine. There'll be far more experienced COP veterans than me around the table, but my first COP was back in COP26 in Glasgow. It was memorable for many reasons: face masks, COVID tests, celebrity appearances from the royal family to the Wombles, and ultimately, I think, a pretty decent set of outcomes. But the main feeling it brings to mind is one of huge optimism. It almost felt like peak net zero, certainly in the UK at that COP and in the year following. Net zero had been enshrined in law just 2 years prior, building on the Climate Change Act that came before it, and our Prime Minister at the time was busy planning to build back greener. I think it's fair to say that just 4 years on, things feel rather different. Huge progress has been made, there's no doubt about that. The UK has cut power sector emissions by around 3/4 since 1990, but we do need to confront the uncomfortable truth that the political and societal consensus we enjoyed around net zero in the UK and elsewhere has now completely broken down. It's easy to dismiss this as populism or a natural phase in a cycle, easy to find comfort in the like-minded peers we bump into around the blue zone echo chamber. But the reality is that right now people are struggling with energy bills and a continuing cost of living crisis. The very near-term challenges they face in their lives will always trump the ever-present but less immediate threat of climate change. And it's easy to tap into this sentiment and weaponize it to slow progress. We all know that the only way to overcome this is by building a cleaner and more secure energy system based on homegrown renewables. And the solutions are coming, whether it's renewable energy, setting the price more often, grid upgrades, bringing more of it to homes and business, or the flexibility and smart demand-side solutions that will optimize it all. But the full benefits of all that are yet to be felt, and in the meantime we face a battle for hearts and minds, just as investment needs to ramp up. That is why we waited to use the time, or wanted, sorry, to use the time here together at COP to have a more honest conversation about this challenge and how we might work together to overcome it. To demonstrate once and for all that cheaper bills and a cleaner energy system are not mutually exclusive, as some would have you believe. because ultimately I believe there is a lot more alignment out there than the media might lead us to believe. That most people want to stop climate change and move to a cleaner energy system. Polling still bears this out. But trust is low, concerns are high, and we've all got a job to do to chart a course that delivers value for consumers. So I'm really looking forward to getting the wide range of views and perspectives I fully expect from around the table, and hope that this is something we can continue long after this COP. So thank you, and I think I'm handing over to Lord Turner.
Great, thanks, Alistair. Let me start this reflection by remembering that when I became the first chair of the UK Climate Committee in April 2008, our official legislated target was to reduce our emissions by 60% by 2050. We were given the task at the CCC of deciding whether it should increase to 80%, and 3 months later we recommended that it should increase to 80%, but that was the target at that time. And interestingly, if people had said to us in 2008, can it be 100%, we'd have probably said, wow, that really is going to be expensive. What then happened was really 10, 12, 13 years of rising optimism of what we could do. That reflected the fact that a lot of the technology costs came down far faster than we thought. I remember, and David Kennedy, who was my chief executive there, now running SBTI, reminded me last night, we were debating then when offshore wind might get below £150 per megawatt hour as a key measure of where we get to success. Solar has come down far faster than we thought. Batteries have come faster than we thought. And that took us, and it took just the UK and the rest of the world, to an increasing sense of optimism of what could be achieved. Also, because of the IPCC 1.5 degree centigrade report, a greater sense of what we needed to achieve. And that then led to, in the late 2010s, the UK committing to net zero by 2050, but that was only in the Climate Change Act revision of 2019, but a whole swathe of banks and countries and companies across the world committing to net zero. But net zero was not a term we used in the Climate Change Committee in 2008. And as you say, I think it was almost probably Glasgow, November 2021 was probably the apogee of the optimism. Things are really very difficult now. We're looking at an IEA report came out on Wednesday that says 1.5 without an overshoot is really not credible. We've got America completely out of the process and indeed trying to interfere and prevent other people making progress. We've got a lot of companies and moving out of net zero alliances, net zero banking alliances, and in the UK, sadly, the political consensus that we had has completely broken down, not just because of the rise of reform, but because the Conservative Party have moved away from the consensus of which they were a key element. And it was, of course, Theresa May who pushed forward net zero in 2019. Why has that occurred? I think it's important for us to know why it's occurred. I think Russia-Ukraine was fundamental. And the rise of energy prices that occurred after there just had a razor focus on what am I paying for energy. And what am I paying for energy, even if I'm not worried by energy costs per se, though they were very strongly in the first year after it, there's just a sense of a cost of living crisis in general, and therefore anything which costs is worrying to people. The second thing is the rise in interest rates. Let's be clear, in 2019, which I think was when, or was it 2020, when we had the AR4 offshore wind bids come in at £39 per megawatt hour, people were looking at a gilt rate, a risk-free interest rate, which was 1%, and real interest rates, which were negative in real terms. That low cost of capital was transformational for the cost of renewables, and we now have a completely different world in terms of the cost of capital. We have also had in the UK and across the world, a generalized polarization of politics, a rise of both extreme right and extreme left, a sense that social media makes people go down their own rabbit holes of self-reinforcing beliefs and misinformation. And one of the most interesting things we've had at the last year at the Energy Transition Commission was having a real expert on social media explain to us the overlapping nexus between anti-immigration, climate change denial, and the toxic manosphere. I mean, you wouldn't necessarily believe that those are the same thing, but they are strongly aligned and they reinforce. All of that could lead us to be very worried about, are we going to be able to keep this consensus? The positive news is that if you ask people, at least in Europe and even in the US, do they believe in climate change and do they want to do something about it, they still say they do. So there is a latent support that we've got to make sure is created and driven through. Very interesting in the UK's latest big by-election in Wales that everybody thought would be won by Reform Party, a totally anti-climate change action. It was actually run in a landslide by Plaid Cymru, closely allied with the Greens, whose attitude to climate change is, I would fear, a little bit too radical, demanding that we achieve, unbelievably rapid cuts immediately. And the Green Party is now actually the most dynamic increase in support in the UK. So we are in danger of having a polarization between climate change denial on the one hand and radical, undeliverable requirements on the other. What are we going to do about it? That's the subject of this debate, but just a few things. I think we've got to have a razor-sharp focus on the costs which ordinary people face. And I think we all know that. Ed Miliband, the government, have gone out with a very strong set of promises that energy bills will come down. That has got to be delivered. If that has to be delivered by forms of change in the tax regime, forms of subsidy, then we've got to do that. We've also got gas at the margin, even if contracts from renewables are lower. And in all aspects of that, a razor-sharp focus. For instance, on heat pumps. We've told an optimistic story that heat pumps are cheaper. Heat pumps are cheaper if your ratio of electricity price to gas price is below 2.5. If it's 3 or above, they're not cheaper. We need to know that, and we need a strategy to deal with that. And I think we've got to also just win the argument again. We've got to win the long-term argument that action on climate change and heading towards a zero-carbon economy is good for energy security. It's good for the development of jobs in our economy, particularly in what we need to do within the housing sector, and that it's good for the world, because we still do have that latent belief out there that it's important that we deal with climate change, both for its impact on the UK and for the whole world. So I'm still confident that we can limit global warming well below 2 degrees centigrade, that the UK can and still should stick to its targets for net zero, but we need to be very realistic about the difficult situation in which we now face ourselves and very clear on the strategy to deal with it.
Fantastic scene setter there from Lord Taylor, thank you. Just because you touched on jobs there, and because I know that we've got Ephraim from LinkedIn here who published a report only yesterday, I think, on the point of how this transition is leading to more and more skilled jobs and how that's delivering value. Can I just ask you to come in on the jobs angle here, which is perhaps not landed that well, because you tend to hear more about deindustrialization, about North Sea oil jobs disappearing. What are the facts telling you?
Boom. So I think first and foremost, jobs is going to be something that excites people. That is what people need to feel. They need to feel they're a part of the transition. And oftentimes what people are asking, the same way that we're talking about the other side of prices being higher, is what's my livelihood going to be? And if you feel like your livelihood is under attack, I think it's pretty natural to resist that transition. I think you can hear from my accent, I'm Scottish. So what we see in the U.S. is that we've othered people who've worked for generations in carbon-intensive industries, giving us the energy to even get to this point. And I think it's really important to figure out how we can honor those commitments, because so much of the commitment to that work is part of their identity, the communities and the jobs that they've had in their families for generations. So the place where we start from LinkedIn is the data. What do we see in the data about what this transition looks like? The first thing we see is that demand for workers in this space is growing fast. Workers with green skills do about 40% better in the labor market in terms of how quickly they're able to change jobs. That's a real big difference. And what we actually see is that workers who've worked in fields like oil, gas, and mining have a lot of the skills we need. And I can hear anecdotally from so many of these companies, that's who you hire to work in renewables. What we see in the data is they have so many of the skills to be working in this space. So obviously there's a huge opportunity. The problem is if you ask those workers, do they see themselves in this space? The answer is no. Access to the training for those skills, for this transition, they also say no. So that seems like a big disconnect, and a disconnect that is not impossible to fix, but certainly if you think about some of the challenges in the economy writ large, and compare that together with not feeling like you're prepared to be part of the transition, it sets up the environment where that political consensus can become quite frayed. So I think it's really important, and it's not about hey, it's not about bringing them along as much as it's like showing the value that they already have. That there's nothing new who they need. They don't need to change who they are. They can be exactly who they are in the communities that they live in with the skills they already have to be making a real contribution. And I think all this end by saying this: when we look at transitions like the energy transition, same is true with technology transitions. Any time that you have an area where there's a bottleneck, where there are more jobs, more demand, where there is supply, you have to look to new pools of talent to fill those jobs. And I think there are so many pools of talent who already have the skills for this transition about how to help them, let them see that they are so valuable. I think that's going to be, and that one of the best ways to honor the commitment that they've made over the generations is to show them, is have them be part of this future is going to be really important.
Thanks, Stefano. That has to be part of the answer. I'm going to pick on one more person, and I'm just going to ask people to stick their hands up and we'll try and right, which is often talked about. The UK having some of the highest energy prices for companies in the world. What do we do about that? And how much is that a root cause of some of the challenges that we're facing when you talk to members?
Thanks, Glenn. Yeah, just picking up on some. As we looked at the transition on this journey of where the political census is also breaking down, is because energy security has become pivotal to economic security of our economies. And part of that is also then thinking about what are the industries of the future that we need as the UK, or every country is thinking about this. And on industrial energy costs, it's an issue that's plagued by chronic underinvestment in energy infrastructure, but also how do we create a new energy system that can meet the demands of these various different sectors. So at the moment, what we're struggling with, and it's not designed to what Adair Turner was saying, that the marginal price of gas is what is setting the price at the moment, despite the fact that what I really want to leave on the point here is that we've seen this blend on industrial strategy, right? Uniquely, whether that was with the IRA, whether that's looking at the Draghi's competitiveness report, and looking to the future now, energy is competitiveness and security. That's really difficult when we think about what are we talking about on net zero. What we're talking about is really now the energy trilemma, really, and we have to go back to those principles of we need energy security, it also needs to be affordable, it needs to provide that equity, but it also needs to achieve decarbonisation at the same time. And there are some trade-offs that have to be made dependent on what you're trying to achieve. So that is the thorniest issue, and I think that's where on the political consensus, it cannot be argued by any political party. This is put everything to one side on net zero language, energy, climate change, sustainability, you name it. This is about delivering that part on energy security. And that's difficult in forums like this. It doesn't mean that companies are putting to bed their net zero targets. It's just a different way of reframing. And that's a challenge on all of us, looking globally at where the debate is. How do we actually cover that in a new way of reframing what we're trying to achieve? And it's that jobs, security, growth element that we need to be thinking about. call it what you want, but everybody is pursuing that economic strategy. And I've been really taken aback by here, being at COP, when you hear other countries from the developing world also talking about what they're trying to pursue. They are moving faster because they're seeing this as an economic strategy. And we as the UK have a huge role to play in the governance structures, in our leading corporates, to be able to actually share best practice. But we also need to move faster, essentially, and industrial energy costs is core to that, or we will lose out some businesses and sectors, and that's a strategic decision that we're making in the UK.
Great, so we'll open it up, so I don't have to orchestrate everything. So Giles and then Bev. And a reminder for those watching, if there are anyone watching at home, please introduce yourselves at the same time. Thank you.
Thank you, Glenn. Giles Dixon, Wind Europe. There is a perception that net zero is too expensive. Even if you recognise it will save you money in the long term, you're worried it's going to require big upfront investments, and when there's a cost of living crisis, you can't afford to fork out thousands for a heat pump or an electric vehicle. Net zero is then perceived too much as a negative agenda, a no you can't agenda. No, you can't keep your gas boiler. You can't keep your car. You can't eat meat. You can't go on exotic holidays. Somehow we've allowed all sorts of messages to get caught up in the narrative around net zero. We haven't done enough to plug the positive narrative that it means lower energy bills sooner rather than later, in fact, and that it means lots of jobs and investments. And then, of course, as others have said, we've got caught up on the wrong side of the polarization of politics, society, and that growing urban-rural divide geographically within industrial societies. Net zero is perceived to be part of what the urban metropolitan liberal elite want to do. In the Netherlands, they call it the oat milk elite. In Germany, they call it the muesli brigade. And we are lumped together with a liberal approach to migration, a liberal approach to sexual orientation, and a liberal approach to globalization and trade, things that so many people on the right are turning against. Somehow we've got to get people on the right, including the far right, to recognize we tick their boxes. We give them local energy. We make them less dependent on Russian imports. Of course, a lot of people on the far right quite like being dependent on Russian energy imports. That's another matter. But not all of them do. Some of them, the idea of independence, energy security should resonate. Plus, in renewables, we're creating jobs in rural communities, the communities they represent. It's what wind does. Onshore wind, there are not many sectors investing billions in rural communities around Europe. Then we need some new champions. Greta Thunberg was great, but she was the daughter of Swedish actors. I mean, yeah, of course she was going to say what she did. We found quite inadvertently in Romania a coal miner. We took him up to the top of a wind on social media in Romania. There's the famous Vattenfall video with Samuel L. Jackson and the seaweed crisps. He's also helping us be a champion. We must get the military on board. They get it. On energy security, national security. We need to be careful because a lot of them are saying with the new forms of warfare, we need maximum possible volumes of aviation fuel, which in the short and medium term are going to have to be fossil-based. We do have the energy-intensive industries increasingly on our side. They get it, and Draghi has helped here, that to stay competitive, they've got to get out of fossil and get into electricity. It's just, again, that valley of death, that big jump they've got to make, those big upfront investments to electrify their factories, and they need public financial support with that.
I couldn't agree more with you on the point you made about not ignoring the right. If you can just, as a generalisation, there's a right-wing agenda against this, and we have to find arguments that speak to all sides. And I completely agree that much of, or if not all of what we're offering here is ticking a lot of those boxes. You talked about the no you can't agenda, and having said I'll open it up, I'm just going to come to Sophie before I come to Bev, because I think that you're probably the person on the table who deals with this more than most when you bring out a carbon budget that has some recommendations in it about what needs to happen to hit our next carbon budget. I'm being attacked by a fly here. Over to you. How do we deal with the no you can't agenda?
Thanks. So I'm Sophie Vipond. I'm the Director of External Affairs at the Climate Change Committee, currently serving under Nigel Topping, who is our new chair, and many of you will know from his international work over the last several decades. This year we published the 7th Carbon Budget Advice in February, and we had a lot of conversations about the communication of the no you can't. We spent a lot of time working not just on the analytical advice, but the framing of the advice. And I think what's incredibly important is that we are actually saying, yes, you can. You can have the car. It will be electric because it will be cheaper, and it will be more pleasant for you. You can warm your home. It will be eventually with a heat pump if it's made cheaper, because that will be a more pleasant experience, and you will not risk poisoning your children with all sorts of pollutants in your house. You can still eat meat. We ended up on quite a few front pages with a story about how many kebabs you can have a week. We recommended that the average person drops their consumption from 8 to 6. Several people pointed out that anyone eating 6 kebabs may have other issues, but I think the whole point of what we were trying to communicate is that this is a yes you can agenda. The thing that I've been noting down while we've been talking, and it may not surprise you given that my background's in communications, is just really important that we also challenge the premise of the fact of a breakdown. This room is full, right? We are all working on this agenda. In the UK, we have halved emissions since 1990. We are world leading. We are the country in the G7 that is on this game. And I think there is sometimes too much of a concern about seeing an immediate political and media problem, often originating in Westminster and Whitehall, and not remembering that we have done incredible work. And that work has essentially been led by a lot of the people around this table. And so every time we are questioned about a political consensus breakdown, I want you to start by saying, can we just remind you that the reason we have been so successful on energy decarbonisation in this country is 14 years of conservative leadership, so much for work, and I just want to be really proud of the fact that the cross-party consensus got us here. What got us here won't get us there, but I think we just need to kind of calibrate that as part of the conversation. And then the only other note I was going to take, I don't want to take up too much time, is that now we have to work on how this transition feels for people. And I think if you talk about how it feels and how we communicate it, we're going to do the other half of those emissions, and that's the really big next step for everyone here today.
Thank you, and I think actually my points really follow that well, because so I'm Bev Cornaby, I'm the Director of the UK Corporate Leaders Group. I'm based at the Cambridge Institute for Sustainability Leadership. We work with business and government in actually enabling this transition and really support the kind of the leadership side, and that is something where actually you're talking about the stories, and I think we don't always tell our own story that well. We've brought a report out this week on how the UK's climate targets have unlocked business action and investment. And actually, when you look at what the UK is doing in terms of business action, as well as obviously what's come from government, alongside the reduction in emissions, then we know that up to 50% of the businesses, so there's nearly 13,000 businesses in the global race to zero, so that was created through the COP process. 50%, over 50% of those are from the UK, 59% of the FTSE 100 are members of the Race to Zero, 62% of nearly 10,000 SMEs in the Race to Zero are also UK businesses. Every year there is now a net zero census. That is looking at how we're doing, how are organisations reporting that they are doing against their net zero targets. That shows that of those that responded, 54% of large UK organisations have set a net zero target, 25% have actually achieved measurable reductions in their carbon footprint. And this is significant because sometimes we talk about the overall, and actually there's a lot of organisations that are contributing to that and who are taking those really positive steps. We do, though, have a challenge in actually how we talk about this. And this is also something that has been looked at in a UK context recently. And this is in spite of, and I am going to give you one more stat that is, I think, really significant about the UK economy, and that is that in 2024, the total contribution of net zero to the UK economy was 83.1 billion. That means the net zero economy is 3 times more than that of the UK economy as a whole in terms of the rate of growth. But we do have a challenge. Some of that challenge is with the terminology. In another piece of work that's actually been done going out to a number of British people, so over 7,000 British people, there is still overwhelming support for climate action. And they're proud of the UK's efforts to actually address climate change. The thing is, though, net zero, the term, is one of the challenges. If you actually ask them about what support they would give, 50% to 64% support if you actually put net zero in that phrasing and say, benefits such as cleaner energy supply and new jobs are clearly explained. When you actually take net zero out of the statement, 78% will support it. And that shows that we actually are not always very good at communicating to people in the same way. And I have to say, I really love the Romanian example. And I would actually point to in the UK, our TUC, so our Trade Unions Congress. They have done some great examples of people actually within business talking up and talking about what they're doing and saying, my job is going to be at stake in the cleaner transition if we stop this. And I think it's those stories, but also the framing. And certainly there's ways that we think that it could be framed and that come out through this survey that is about, we need to talk about an unstoppable momentum towards renewable energy and a low-carbon society. And things like COP30 can help us reap the benefits of that. We also can say that it's charting a better future for our children and a cleaner, fairer society for all. And finally, things like a successful COP, so being here, having these discussions, can help protect our cherished natural environments and wildlife. These are things that we've discovered resonate with UK people and are ways that we need to talk about this, is what does this mean to people to help them understand that they are, that they are benefiting from the transition and that we need to keep going at it.
Brilliant, important points there. I'm conscious I've talked about the need to not ignore the right. And I've completely ignored the right side of the table, but we'll start in the centre with Wafa and then carry on.
That's a good place to start. Yeah, I'll give that back. Wafa Jaffrey, I'm a partner. I have the privilege of leading our global energy transition team for KPMG. Thank you. I take instructions well. I love that we're talking about communication, right? Because I think I can sit here and literally throw facts at you and percentages at you, mainly because we also sponsor the Energy Stats Review with Energy Institute that looks at what is happening globally. But I think communication and that emotional link is such a major part of what we need to do. I mean, we worked on the IGP for offshore wind for the UK, and I believe we missed the chance that you've talked about with regards to, what happened in Romania, to actually publicize the investment that can go in and what offshore wind can achieve for the UK in an investment point of view. One of the things, the communication part is so much so a problem that even as an advisory firm, one of the things we're going to look to do from next year onwards is start a TikTok channel, and we're going to talk about doing myth busting. So facts like, did you know that UK actually has the cleanest water across the entire world? We have really bad rep for our water sector, we have really bad rep for our energy sector in terms of the investment, etc. But it's about connecting with people. And a large part of the way that we're designing it is instead of me having makeup and heels on and talking about this, we're actually going to get the real people engaged that Ephraim you mentioned as well, who are actually have been bearing the brunt of, a transitioning energy system, transitioning away from coal, transitioning away from oil and gas. And I think including those in the communities and the communication is going to be quite an important part.
Okay, hands down this end, Lisa.
Well, I also love the fact that we're talking about communication. So I'm Lisa Weech. Is that over the last 5 years, we've been under massive pressure to ramp up for regulation around climate commitments and how we speak about them, which is important, especially with CSRD and others. But what that has meant has been the narrative has very often been about CO2e, not just even CO2. It's been about scopes. It's been about getting ready for assurance. And that has become such a big focus because we want to be able to build credibility with numbers and data. But on the flip side of that, we ignore some of the messaging about the real stories. And now we're having to rethink our whole communications apparatus to actually be able to tell the story about how does this feel, how is it an opportunity, but also to decentralize the message. Because I think something that is a real challenge is that one of the keys to combating climate fatalism and to building agency is to have local messages and local representatives, because people believe those that they know and that they trust. But actually making that switch from a centralized communication to a decentralized approach it's easy to say and hard to do. So it's another area where I think hopefully we can work together, but it's something that will take resources as well.
Thank you. Steve Smith of National Grid. So just an observation on the communications point. We have a very wise person who works in our US business who once said to me, Steve, you're bringing facts to a feelings fight. And I think you need to recognise in this that quite often it's a feelings fight. And I think a lot of what's been said around communications has really channeled into that, and we should all remember that. Then I wanted to go back to the US, because in the US we operate in two of the most progressive states, so New York and New England, that actually have some of the most far-reaching climate goals and legislation to back it of anywhere in the US. And even they are struggling, and you are seeing that consensus break down. And don't forget, particularly if you think of New England, that's one of the richest states in the US, and they've always felt that they could afford this. And it's the same driver that Adair said. Fundamentally, it's affordability. And it's worth thinking about in the global context, because they compete with all the other states. And so, despite the US being blessed with very low energy prices, New England has some of the highest energy prices anywhere in the US. And they are finding it increasingly hard to keep on the path they'd set. So I do think we need to get back to thinking about affordability, and for me that's all about economic growth. And that's not just growth in the economy, but it's actually the growth in the incomes of people who pay energy bills. And so I think the more we can do to lean into the economic growth agenda, then the easier it will be to win some of these feelings fights, because I think those are the feelings that are driving it. People know they need to do something about this. They do care. They do want to do it. But when they're struggling to put food on the table or actually heat their homes, then as I said, those are the feelings that drive their behaviour. It's not that they're anti-net zero. And so the more, and we're an energy networks company, as our SSE, just what we can do to help lean into that growth agenda to actually create the headroom to pay for some of this stuff, I think helps to start to sort of defang some of the affordability debate.
Good afternoon, everyone. Trevor Hutchings. I'm the Chief Executive of the REA, Renewable Energy Trade Body in the UK, representing over 400 businesses from across the value chain. I think the point was made about let's not talk ourselves into a doom spiral here. We are doing a huge amount of progress, and we need to build on that and showcase that. I think one of the characteristics we're in now is one of timing. If you think about the 50% clean power in the UK that Sophia mentioned, the consumer hasn't had to do much to enable that to happen. We're now moving into a period where the consumer has a load of expectations on them to have insulation, to have a heat pump, to engage in flexibility markets, getting automate it, and that's one of the things that we need to get better at, to automate, to make this easier. That's got to be part of the planning around our approach here on in. But we've got to recognise, by the same token though, we've just made the consumer able to no longer be a passive recipient of their bill, but an active, able to actively influence their bill through all of those mechanisms that were never there before. Factual. There isn't a ready supply chain of non-renewable assets ready to be deployed at cheap cost that's going to bring down bills. That simply isn't the case. A new gas-fired power station now is 3 times what it used to be, more expensive than renewables. And we've got to understand that. The grid upgrade that is going on at the moment, 70-80% is about leadership, but we've got to win the argument on costs, which is the point that has been well made here. Thank you.
Thanks, Trevor. Would you mind if I just brought in Chris? We'll come back to you, Alan, because there was a great lead-in from Trevor there around how we need to make things easier for consumers, how we've done the easy bit where they haven't really had to do anything because we've just been decarbonising supply. here we've got a company that's doing a lot in that space. So I just wanted to bring you in, Chris, and then we'll come back to Alan if that's okay. You probably haven't got a microphone, so I'll give you this one.
Well, thanks very much. My name is Chris Fitzgerald. I'm from Octopus Energy, and I think that's a great jumping off point. Just before I come to that, I might reflect on something that Beth was saying earlier around the fact that there is actually more public support for net zero than people recognise. Maybe using different language, but it's there. But that was the levelised cost of energy has reduced so dramatically over the last 10 years. People understandably feel like they're being sold a pup because they're not seeing that in their pockets. And what can you do about that? Well, Lord Turner has talked about necessary reforms so that we are not seeing gas prices setting our bills 97% of the time, the highest in Europe. And perhaps enabling renewable generation to be built near where it's needed. But as Trevor says, we need to make this transition simple and accessible for consumers, relentlessly thinking about them. And in Octopus, that's what we do. And so you asked about heat pumps or electric vehicles. Actually, I mean, we've got electric vehicle products that are far cheaper than the internal combustion engine counterparts, and we continue to innovate. So we have just recently launched a vehicle-to-grid product that basically gives you your charging for free. We also have homes where you can go for 10 years without paying an electricity bill, and that is enabled by, and I think that combination of innovation, a real focus on the consumer, a recognition that it would be arrogant not to see that affordability is essential to the transition to maintain a social consensus, is key to this conversation. So thank you very much for bringing us in.
Can we hear me? No. Okay, there we go. Right. So my name's Alan Thompson. I lead the global energy business at Arup, so management consultancy, engineering, delivery. So getting stuff done. I was in Glasgow that we would exit all hydrocarbon activity. We have done that. We are a much more successful organisation in our energy business. As a result of that, we're bringing in people active. Now, they say the picture tells 1,000 words. One of the things that I was just looking at this morning, came out yesterday, was the updated carbon action tracker. You'll all know it, the thermometer and so forth. That thermometer is currently showing an optimistic 1.9 degrees centigrade rise, 1.9 degrees. So for me, that's saying we've really got to get our act together. We've really got to start delivering this stuff. And of course, SSE is starting to do that in terms of their 33 billion investment plan that was announced a couple of days ago. If I also look at the other side of pictures telling 1,000 words, I want to call out the recent EMBA report, the Electric Tech report, which is an absolutely fantastic report showing almost in pictures how efficient the electrical approach is. And I know from discussions that Darren and I have had, looking at how we can get usable energy. None of us care about primary energy. Primary energy is a fossil thing. Useful energy is what we're all about. So how do we get to the point of useful energy? How do we demonstrate that to people that it's the right thing for everybody? Just one little anecdote. I was in Vietnam on an offshore wind DBT thing a few weeks ago. Saturday evening, grabbed a beer, sat down next door to two Aussie guys from Newcastle, so from the Australian Newcastle, which is still pretty coal-oriented. And he was saying, "What are you doing here?" And I said, "Well, I'm here for an offshore wind help to accelerate what they're doing." "Oh, that's a load of rubbish, that. All this renewables is a load of rubbish," he said. So what about solar? "Oh yeah, I've got a battery." Yeah. And you know what? It's a lot cheaper. So I was just thinking, okay, maybe we don't need to persuade everyone. Maybe we just need to let them get on in their little world. But if they're doing it anyway, then we're in a good space. So anyway, I'll stop on that happy note.
Thanks a lot. I'm Hamid Bawa from Hitachi Energy, and you hear me? Closer? Even closer.
that better? No.
Well, thanks. I think it's interesting that you know, every time we start to make progress, we think of some reason or the other to kind of start creating doubts in our way. And if you look at, for instance, the whole topic now about energy security. Energy security and energy transition can very much go hand in hand. In fact, they're very complementary. So these type of distractions, I think, what's the cost of inaction? I mean, we've seen, for example, closer to where many of us work, when it comes to grids. We've underinvested for decades. Now we are basically complaining about the cost of grids. What is the alternative? We can keep building connection queues. We can put a lot of money into abatement costs, like the point that was made earlier. I mean, if it's not renewables, what else? And then you have large emerging markets growing even at 7-8% GDP, large markets like India, who are then tackling energy transition at the same time. And that's a challenge as well. Sometimes we kind of lose sight of where different countries of the world are. So I think the whole basis of, you know, if the fact that clean electricity is clearly emerging as driving the energy transition, and it's a question of momentum. And I think it's really important that we create the visibility, we see the culmination and energy at the center, whether it's economics, whether it's security, physical security, or even industry. I mean, at the end of the day, all these things we talk about the tech revolution and AI and everything else, it's all energy dependent. And I think the point really is that if we don't do that long-term thinking and really plan for it, we're just going to basically face it at a point in time and then say, oh, now we have supply chain problems, now we have cost issues, now we have everything else. So I think it really needs that longer-term thinking in order to tackle these topics.
Okay, I think we've now heard from everybody. So does anybody else want to come back in? Or I might try and summarize a little bit. Everybody's happy. Lord Turner.
I was just very interested by the comments to my left on language, and I never thought about it before, but you know, zero is not a positive thing. Low is not a positive thing. Should we call it not net zero, but 100% clean?
A good provocation. You remind me of listening to Arnold Schwarzenegger, of all people, hero of mine, but talking in New York. And he said, you know, what I don't understand is that everyone's talking about, you know, climate change, all these things. What we need to be talking about is pollution. We're tackling pollution. It's a terrible impression, but it kind of goes to Bev's point, I think. Thank you, everybody, for your great contributions. To try to summarize, I think we've heard a lot about the communications challenge that we've all got here, the fact versus feelings debate that I think Steve articulated really nicely, and the need to focus on the positives. I think Sophie called out the sort of the trap that we've fallen into in the name of this session, even in being a bit too negative about where we are with consensus. And actually there's a bit more consensus still left there than you might be led to believe, to Alistair's point, because a lot of the things we've talked about are things that everybody can get behind. The yes you can agenda as opposed to the no you can't agenda, and the link to what this transition is enabling rather than preventing in terms of jobs, skills, economic growth. And that takes you to a stronger focus on industrial strategy, as Tanya outlined, a carbon power system is going to unlock potential, whether it's renewable power that we can't yet make the most of enough of the time because we can now get it to more people more often, whether it's the potential of people to upskill and transition in their jobs, whether it's potential for businesses to connect to the grid where they're struggling to at the moment and grow and invest, whether it's potential for economic growth in the round, potential to capture the AI opportunity that everyone keeps talking about. This is what the transition is enabling, and the more we can talk about those things, we're going to start to close this gap between the polarization that we talked about and you know the social media echo chamber, what that contributes to that, and you kind of get climate change mitigation thrown in for free. So a really good conversation. Thank you to everybody for your time here, and I hope that we can continue this because we all need to kind of get on board and win this fight, fact versus feelings. Thanks everyone.